the Good Old Days podcast. This is Maggie Coomer.
And this is Jasmin Brand.
And we're bringing you season 2 of the Good Old Days. Welcome back. Jasmin, how you doing? How was your 3-week break?
It was great. I guess everyone will hear about it when we start our blog posts, but I went on a really nice trip, saw a lot of historical sites, and I'm really excited to be back.
What was your favorite historic site that you visited? You went through the southwest, right?
Yes. I went from Arizona to California during COVID, which was not easy. And I have to say they were being a lot stricter than we are in Tennessee. But I think probably my favorite place was the Carrillo, and I'm mispronouncing that, the Carrillo Monument in San Diego, which is on this hilltop or a cliff top, and you can see the whole city, and it was just absolutely gorgeous. It's apparently where the guy who I mispronounced his name, Carrillo, something like that, where he first, quote unquote, discovered San Diego, completely ignoring that, of course, there was an indigenous population there. But yes, it's a really, really pretty site.
Cool. Awesome. I can't wait you're going to write about that, right?
I am. Yeah,
All
I'm in the process of doing that now.
Okay, so people might be scratching their heads when we say blog posts. So let's talk a little bit about what we accomplished over these 3 weeks. So we weren't just hanging out, okay? Yeah, Jasmin took a trip, but she was pretty much working constantly. And while I was back in Tennessee, I was also working constantly. We've finished the website. The website is now live. That is thegoodoldayspod.com. We are now officially a .com. The website, I'm really proud of it, but it basically puts everything in one place. So if you want to listen to our episodes, you don't necessarily want to go through a particular player. Our episodes are on the website with a nice little description and a complete streamlined source list, a complete source list. So if you're looking for the source list, head to our website. Again, that's thegoodoldayspod.com. There is also a link if you want to support the show. You can view our Instagram and Twitter feeds in one spot. And as we were talking about the blog, within a couple of weeks, we are going to launch the T-God blog, the Good Old Days blog. Yeah, so we're going to have a lot of contributing posts, written articles from some of our friends in the museum field and, historical interpretation. We've got a couple of exciting posts on material culture, women's work. We have a friend of ours who is currently writing a historical fiction novel about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. She's going to write a post for us. So we're really excited about the diverse content that we're about to be posting. So we're not all talk, right? We also write too. So Jasmin and I are both writers, and we thought that was a great way to kind of showcase our literary skills, if you will, or at least, our work in progress literary skills. And we're excited. So visit the site. Tell us what you think. Lots of cool stuff there. And it's also a great place if you want to leave us feedback. There's a contact form. And you can send us a glowing review. You can send us constructive feedback. No haters, please. And I'm just super proud of the site. So glad to have it up and running. And you can find this episode, 2.1, part 1 of our series about H.H. Holmes.
Also, this is a 2-part episode. So if you immediately want to listen to part 2, if you sign up for our Patreon, that is on there right now as you're listening, and you can get it a week ahead of time. And we'll have an extra bonus little episode for you next week, so you don't have to wait 2 weeks to listen to our usually scheduled programming.
It's at patreon.com/thegoodoldayspod. Again, there's a link for that right in smack dab in the middle of the front page of our website, thegoodoldayspod.com. So visit our new website. Tell us what you think. So what are we talking about today, Jasmin?
Oh, we've got a really good story. So we're going to be talking about H.H. Holmes, which, if you have heard of him, you've probably heard that he was the first serial killer in the United States. And yeah, we're going to get into him, and I'm really excited. Really excited.
Yeah, this guy is like the louse of the louses. He's like the king of the criminals. I mean, he really is. His entire life was just an exercise in criminal enterprising. That's it. I mean, it's insane. It's really an insane story. And yeah, so let's get into it. I mean, let's talk. Well, let's first let's talk about a little bit about our research for this episode. So, of course, anybody who has ever heard of H.H. Holmes knows of the book by Eric Larson called The Devil in the White City, published, I believe, in 2002. It ignited interest in this largely forgotten figure. I read Devil in the White City a long time ago, but when I read it, I don't think I was mature enough to fully comprehend what I was reading. I definitely wasn't mature enough to fully comprehend how beautiful this book is. I mean, I would put this on par with Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. Like, it's that kind of creative nonfiction. And it just tells an incredible story and really paints H.H. Holmes as this, like, a bloodthirsty murderer. Eric Larson supposedly quoted a statement that Holmes made in a confession that he wrote for a newspaper called the Philadelphia Inquirer. He wrote this confession shortly before his hanging in 1896, and the quote attributed to Holmes is this, quote, "I was born with the devil in me," he wrote. "I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing." Now, I will say that I read that Philadelphia Inquirer confession this morning, and the only reference to the word devil is Holmes saying that he had the line of a devil on his face, like he looked like some sort of evil entity. But I couldn't actually put my eyes on that quote. And that quote is attributed to Holmes in almost everything that you read about him. So I thought that was pretty interesting. But I think it shows how this has become, he's become the stuff of legend. It's no longer the real man as the history. It's terror and murder and bloodlust. And he's really portrayed as being ruled by his murderous impulses. But I don't necessarily agree with that. I actually think that Holmes was first and foremost a con man. He was a confidence man. He was a swindler. His entire life was about defrauding others so he could become as rich as possible. I think all of the crimes that he committed were in the service of him generating capital. That's what I think. After all the research that we've done, that's what I've concluded. I don't necessarily think that he was a bloodlust kind of killer. I think he killed because he wanted to get people out of the way. He didn't want to get caught.
He was an opportunist.
Absolutely.
Like classic criminal opportunist is how I read Holmes.
So who the hell was H.H. Holmes? Well, that was not his real name. That was one of several aliases. Holmes had no fewer than 12 aliases. But he was born Herman Webster Mudgett. He was born May 16th, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. His parents were Methodist farmers. So he, according to Holmes, and I'm just going to call him Holmes. That's how I'm going to refer to him from here on out. But according to Holmes, his parents were very strict. They believed in corporal punishment, and some sources say he was abused as a kid. Holmes himself said he had a pretty normal upbringing, but then again, Holmes has told several different versions of his life, given several different confessions, so it's really hard to understand exactly what is true and what is not. And his essentially origin story is a little creepy. Jasmin, what's his origin story? What kind of like ignites his interest in the human body? Because he becomes a doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is from his autobiography, correct?
His
Oh, sorry.
memoir that he wrote in
in prison, yes.
in prison. Yes.
Yeah, so from his memoir, and so we have to take this with a massive grain of salt because he recants all of this while he's, basically waiting for execution. But anyway, in his memoir, he says that when he was 5 years old, some neighborhood bullies attempted to terrify him by forcing him into the doctor's office to stand face to face with a full-sized hanging skeleton that I believe he describes as grinning from ear to ear, essentially, which, I mean, skeletons do that. But anyway,
It's just the shape of the jaw, man.
yeah, I know. So he makes it sound, of course, much more sinister than it was, but he says that this was an entirely transformative experience and it ignites his obsession with anatomy. There are some more disturbing stories from his childhood that include trapping and disabling animals in the woods to dissect them while they're still alive. He then kept their skulls under his bed as a morbid trophy and an indication of what was yet to come. And this is a pretty typical sign of serial killers, right? Or people that are going to do awful things later in life. Like you look for the kid who's killing animals.
Yeah, or the kid who sustained some sort of head injury. What it's like what's that called? There's I forget what the name of the scientist is who I think it was like an FBI profiler.
Oh yeah.
The trifecta, you know what I'm talking about? It was like bedwetting, killing animals, head trauma.
Yeah.
I think it's largely been disproved now, or at least there's been a lot of examples that they fall outside of that scope, but that was a really popular theory for a long time, how to categorize or profile serial killers. McDonald triad. There it is.
The McDonald triad.
Yeah, the McDonald triad.
Okay, so moving on from that, he would start working as a teacher at the age of 16. Despite not getting high marks, he just kind of had this overabundance of confidence, and that would follow him through his life and probably enabled him to pull off all of the different cons that he did. And he tries to have a normal life. I mean, he gets married, and Maggie, do you want to talk a little bit about his first family?
His first family, yes. So at the age of 19, Herman Webster Mudgett met and married Clara Leverling while he was working as a teacher in Alton, New Hampshire. Shortly thereafter, he realizes that being a teacher isn't going to provide the financial stability that he is after. He wanted a fortune. He wanted to be rich. So he went ahead and made the decision that he wanted to go to medical school. He, I believe, went to medical school first in Vermont, but that particular institution didn't give him a lot of hands-on time with dissection of human corpses. One thing that's really important to note, during this time in modern medicine, as it's developing, the overwhelming consensus among medical practitioners was that a student had to have a thorough understanding of human anatomy in order to properly practice medicine. Shocker, right? But this was a relatively cavalier idea. The school in Vermont apparently really didn't give him a great opportunity to dissect human skeletons, so he's actually going to transfer and go to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor actually had a reputation for grave robbing. This was not uncommon. So it was almost apparently like a rite of passage that medical students would go and source their own cadavers in the middle of the night, go and dig up bodies freshly, in fresh graves, and then use them for dissection purposes. And medical schools would pay big bucks for cadavers, for skeletons, just for the purpose of understanding anatomy. And this is going to come into play later. So just remember, let's put a pin in that for now. But it's believed that Holmes decided to go to University of Michigan in Ann Arbor because of their reputation for dissecting human cadavers. That was what they were known for. So he probably went there to get that experience. Some sources say that Clara went with him. Some other sources say that he left her. He dumped her, left her in New Hampshire. She was pregnant with a daughter, and that was that. That was the end of his first marriage, and he just left.
Well, the physical end. He never divorced her.
Right. Yeah, he didn't. He actually is going to marry a second time. And apparently he petitioned for divorce 2 weeks after he married the second wife, but never ended up officially filing it. So he remained married to Clara and his second wife. And we'll talk about her in just a second. So what kind of student was he? He was an average student. And I don't know why this kind of bothered me. It just kind of felt like people writing about Holmes now really like to rub in the fact that he was an average student, as if this is like something that would make him roll over in his grave, so to speak, like calling him an average student. I don't know why. It just kind of seemed like a post-mortem insult to me whenever I read it.
Yeah. I read that he was near the bottom of his class, and that's, again, something that people would really like to bring up. And I just think it's interesting because one of the documentaries I watched, they talk about how he did go through and he finished all of his schooling, which is really unusual for people that end up being serial killers. Like most serial killers have such a big confidence about them and have so much like self-importance that they will end up leaving school at some point through like college years.
Like they feel like they're better than everything else.
Mhm.
And yeah.
Yeah, so they
Well,
would
I mean, I totally get that. And that's almost like a psychopathy, like a complex. And I mean, Holmes had an ego on him for sure, but I feel like he would go along with things as long as he needed to satisfy his ends. And he knew that he needed to finish medical school to become a doctor and to have that legitimacy, because that's how he was able to sell himself to anybody. I'm a doctor. I'm a professional physician. I have this air of confidence and intelligence, and I can give you everything that you need. I mean, he built this foundation so he could use it for, as a means to an end, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. But that's just something that gets pointed out, and I think that's really interesting because, like if we take any of the more modern serial killers, Bundy never finished. There's no backing behind them as far as education
Yeah, he didn't
goes.
finish law school, did he?
No.
He went for like a year,
Even though
and then represented himself.
Yeah. Like that's a really big point behind him of like he just was so arrogant that he's like, I can do this because I had a year of law school. It's like, no, that's not how that works.
So let's talk about what was his first venture into criminal enterprising.
His first venture. So he had to pay for school, right? And to do that, he decided to work as a traveling salesman for a publishing company. But rather than turn the money in he was getting from his sales, he pocketed them. So I guess a con of sorts. He would sell things to people and then take their money, and I guess presumably
he was a book salesman.
Yeah, I guess presumably they never got their books.
Salesman.
If he's pocketing the money and not giving it to the company, unless he carried them with him, which that's a lot of books.
He probably did.
He carry the books with him.
He probably, yeah, because remember, you remember Encyclopedia Salesman?
Oh yeah. Okay.
They would carry a set and then sell. If they sold the set, then they would have to get another one, or they had like a stock.
That's right.
But yeah, he was a book salesman, and he would do it like on their summer break, when they had breaks from school, natural breaks. He would go and sell these books and then pocket the money. So I think in his memoir, he called that his very first like dishonest deed or something.
I'm sure it was far from his first, but in his mind.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, so he continues to do things like this with other companies as well, and it basically gets him through college. And also, I had read somewhere, and I don't know how truthful this is, that he was at the same time digging up some of those cadavers and selling them to the school because they wouldn't ask questions, and he could do that and earn big money.
Yeah, that was that. I think that's actually the first insurance scam that he ran. So allegedly he met a friend in school who's just referenced as the Canadian. So we'll call him the Canadian. Sorry, anybody from Canada. Like, we're not trying to insult you, but Holmes worked with the Canadian and a couple other friends, and they decided that it would be pretty easy to fake the death of a family of 3 and then pass pass off corpses as long as they were rendered unrecognizable and collect a large insurance policy. And so this is actually going to become like his, what would you call this? It's his
Like signature
it's his
move.
typical crime.
It's his
It's his
signature.
signature move.
Mm-hmm.
It is. And I mean, he
His
does this
MO,
time
I
and
guess?
time and time. His modus operandi. I mean, I feel like modus operandi would be the manner in
Yeah,
which
that's
he
true.
killed. But I guess it doesn't necessarily apply specifically to that. I would say MO is probably good. But yeah, this is his staple. This is the crime. He knows he can pretty much always get it. And it actually ends up being the crime that leads to his downfall. So he graduates from school in 1884. He, at that point, moves out to Portland, Maine, and he really, I'm going to say he hones his skills as a swindler during the next 2 years, okay? I'm going to say he obtained his master's degree in criminal enterprising, if you will, and he runs the same book scheme working for a publisher in Portland, Maine. So he does that for a couple years while also teaching and practicing medicine, but realizes that he is not making the kind of money that he wants to. He wants to be somebody who is fabulously wealthy with lots of property, and he has made the decision that he is going to go to Chicago, bustling city of Chicago. So he arrives in Chicago in 1886, and he's quickly going to put down roots in the small village of Englewood. And side note, Englewood was actually annexed by Chicago in 1889. I pulled that directly from Larson's book. But what happens in Englewood? How does he put down roots?
Well, he acquires, by unscrupulous means, a drugstore owned by an ailing old couple named Mr. and Mrs. Holton by mortgaging the store and promising to pay it back over time. Now, this is essentially going to be a larger version of his book-selling swindle, and soon after he agrees to all of this, Mr. Horton dies of cancer, and Mrs. Horton moves to California, according to Holmes. Now,
this was such a tragic story. It makes me really sad because, like, apparently Mr. Horton, I mean, he was on his deathbed when Holmes shows up. Mrs. Horton's having a tough time running the store by herself. And here comes Holmes, the savior, with his bright blue eyes and his sweet, touching nature. And she thinks that he's been sent by God to save her and her husband. And when the husband dies, well, Mrs. Horton is a vulnerable old woman. And like Jasmin said, apparently she moves to California, never to be seen again. But it's likely that Holmes killed her.
yeah, so he didn't have to pay the mortgage. So he essentially stole the drugstore and would make money off of that.
Yep, absolutely. Now, allegedly, the owner, so I guess they rented the building that the drugstore was in, and the owner started to jack up the rent prices, and so he starts quickly looking for another venture. And just so happens there's a big lot of land right across the street. Now, during this period, in 1887, Holmes met and married a Minnesota woman named Myrta Belknap. And, I mean, she's going to work in the drugstore with him. And their relationship's going to sour because Holmes, as you know, Holmes is a ladies' man. He's on his second wife now. Myrta was his second wife. He hadn't divorced his first wife. And, I mean, women just flocked to him, right? He was, the ultimate confidence man, the ultimate blue-eyed, mustached, hair pomade, always dressed so nice. He essentially bucked the conventions of Victorian era courtship. He would touch you, like, on your arms. He would stare too long. Think of just, like, the most confident man that you can. And, like, how easy it is when somebody is confident, how easy it is just to take their word for it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's how Well, that's how he gets away with things for so long. And I read somewhere, might have been in Larson's book, that Murda never knew about the first wife, nor would she know about his third wife. And so not only is he super confident, but he's really good at juggling all of the women in his life, as well as all of his criminal enterprising.
And his mistresses.
Oh, yeah, don't forget the mistresses.
I mean, this dude, I don't know how he did it. I don't know how he did it because, I mean, the level of complexity of his schemes and the amount of people he had on his line, I mean, it's just unbelievable that he gets away with this stuff for the better part of a decade. Shortly after he marries Murda, Holmes buys the land and begins work on a new building. And this is affectionately known today as the Murder Castle. So, Jasmin, let's talk a little bit about the Murder Castle.
Okay, so Murder Castle. And this is a name that, of course, it's given after after the fact. His intention there is to build basically, I guess, a drugstore on the ground floor and then build some apartments above that he can rent out and he can stay in. And overall, it would become a three-story building. And it's not your typical building. It's not built to any kind of normal scheme. He designed the whole thing himself. And part of his designs were to help him scam. As he's building it, he purposely builds a confusing layout. And part of the reason for that is so he could take in furniture and buy things on credit and hide them in the hotel. Because if they couldn't find the items when they came to repossess them, what could they leave with? So he builds a really confusing structure, essentially, that no one really can ever figure out. And we probably will never really know the full extent of how it was laid out or what was going on there. Now, like I said, the first floor is going to be a pharmacy, so he can continue doing whatever he was doing with that one across the street, and several other retail spaces as well. The second floor would be mostly apartments that he would rent out to different people. And when he adds the third floor on, this was a way for him to, well, increase his fraudulent activity because he hires all different contractors. He doesn't pay anyone. He basically keeps building and keeps building. And he has the idea that this is going to be a hotel for the World's Fair. He can invite people in, probably scam them as well. And I believe his original intention was to build the hotel in such a way of where it had secret hatches and whatnot so he could steal from his clients. And he apparently would go out when the fair was running and try and find like older women who he could charm and invite back to sleep in a comfy bed back at his hotel, which was conveniently located to the fair. So it was a whole mess. And also, as he was running a hotel, he could approach companies that specifically worked for hotels and get them to give him free things. And so he dragged out the construction for as long as possible on that.
Yeah, and talk a little bit about how he hired workers and how he was able to avoid paying for a lot of this castle, a lot of what was being built. I mean, he defrauded everyone.
Oh yeah, I mean there were plenty of people that needed work. Chicago is a massive growing city. And with kind of the changes in industry, there were a lot of people that were willing to do construction work. So he would hire them, complain about their work, fire them without paying them, and then he would change his name. So if they did try and go after them or after him, people would show up and it would be someone under a different name. And oh, that was the last owner, so I'm not responsible for what the new owner is doing. But it was really the same person all along. And he did the same thing to different construction companies. He did the same thing to basically anyone who came to claim money from him.
Yeah, the steel companies. So for the infrastructure of the building, the furniture, that was a big one of his favorite schemes was to buy furniture on credit and then never pay it back. And then angry store owners would show up at the hotel, And he had this amazing power of persuasion. Like it was said to be he would, an irate person would come into a store and say, you swindler, you stole from me. And within 30 minutes, this person is leaving the store with a smile and a cigar and laughing and thinking that Holmes is his best friend. Just a master manipulator. But yeah, he built largely built this structure and furnished it without paying a cent. I mean, he really there was absolutely no way he would be able to do it if he had to pay for it for real. He just lied his way through it to get this massive 3-story, something like 48 bedrooms or something when it was all said and done.
Yeah, something crazy. Yeah, he lied his whole way through it. It was really the peak of his of his con, to have a whole building built for him, furnished. And a lot of times he would take that furniture, sell it for cash, and then go and get a whole new line of credit, buy new furniture to then furnish the building and do it all over again.
Yeah, and he'd hide the furniture in little rooms. There were passages that didn't go anywhere. People would get lost. And so he was, halfway through building the structure in 1888 or 1889. He was halfway through building the structure. And then it's announced that Chicago is going to be the site of the 1893 World's Fair. Tell me about what a big deal this was for Chicago.
Oh, this is massive. I mean, it is going to bring, I can't even remember
how does
many
it change
people.
Chicago?
Well, it changes everything, because you have all of a sudden tourism is going to be a massive boom in Chicago. So you have a lot of building happening, a lot more jobs created in getting prepared for the World's Fair. You have all sorts of new technology coming to Chicago, so they can showcase that. And it's a massive opportunity. And of course, someone like Holmes is going to take advantage of that.
Well, and before the fair, Chicago was really seen as this kind of gross place, right? I mean, it was the stockyards, the pig, the cows. It was a big place for, animal slaughter. It was right on the lake. So it was like basically a mud pit. Like, it was really difficult to build these large skyscrapers because, the sediment was so loose. And so it really inspired a whole new style of architecture as well. So it was just like Chicago was like this metropolis that was aiming to be as respectable as, say, New York or Boston or Philadelphia. But because they were kind of like the redheaded stepchild of the United States from a big city perspective. So when they landed the Chicago World's Fair, they not only had to prove themselves among American cities, they also wanted to outdo the Paris World's Fair.
Yeah, and it was a big deal because this specific World's Fair was supposed to be a celebration of like Columbus landing there. I think what is it, 400 years earlier? Is it 1492?
1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue.
So 1892 is like a big celebration of 400 years of America, really, which we're coming up to Columbus Day. So I guess that's appropriate in a weird way. Not appropriate, really. Columbus Day, whatever. Anyway, not going to get into that right now. But yeah, it was the Columbian World's Fair. So this was a massive deal for not just Chicago, but the United States as a celebration of themselves, essentially. So Chicago, like you said, being this kind of like butcher capital of America where all of the cattle trains went and everything. That's how my family ended up there. They were butchers, actually at this time. Yeah. They showed up from Germany in 1855 and had their own like butcher's shop for years. So they would have been butchers in Chicago while all of this was going on. And I really wish I had something from them to know what it was like to experience that.
Oh, man. But sounds like you need to spend some time on Ancestry.com. But knowing you, I bet you have.
Yeah. Unfortunately, my family didn't like to write a lot of things down, unlike me. So I know where they were and what they were doing, but I haven't been able to find any of their like diaries or anything like that, unfortunately. That's okay.
When Chicago was awarded the honor of being able to put on the next World's Fair, and actually the Paris World's Fair was in 1889, but Chicago secures the next World's Fair set to take place in 1893. And at that point, Holmes just happened to be in the best possible place. He's in Inglewood, like literally a couple blocks away from Jackson Square Park, which would be the site of the World's Fair. So this man sees a serious opportunity, and that's where he starts slapping on that third floor. He's going to make a hotel, because all the hoteliers of Chicago at that point went, holy shit. We are about to get millions and millions and millions of people. I think 32 million people end up going to the Chicago World's Fair during its 6-month running.
Yeah.
So Holmes adds a third floor, and he adds some pretty sinister elements to the hotel at this point. And it's going to get grisly. It's going to get grim. And this is where we're going to pick up in part 2. Now, if you just can't wait until next Wednesday to hear part 2 is now available on patreon.com. On our Patreon feed. You can go to patreon.com/thegoodoldayspod. You can also head to thegoodoldayspod.com and click on our Patreon button there on the front page. It'll take you to Patreon. You can subscribe, get access to part 2, and you will get all of our coming episodes ad-free when we add ads, as well as 1 day early. So if that's something that tickles your fancy, head over to patreon.com and show us some love. Jasmin, what about social stuff?
So, as always, go and follow us on social media to keep up with what we're doing. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at The Good Old Days Pod, and Twitter at The Good OD Pod. And we're still on TikTok because TikTok is still a thing. They managed to save it right at the last hour from the news I read. So follow us on there too. I'll be posting some videos that have to do with the Holmes investigation that we've done.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in to episode 2.1, episode 1 of season 2, part 1 of H.H. Holmes. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.